Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Mary Lesher. I'm the programs manager at Dumbarton House, and we're so excited to bring you this program today. This is the second program in the Black Georgetown Community History Project series, which is brought to you by Dumbarton House, Georgetown Heritage, Mount Zion Female Union Band Society Historic Memorial Park Foundation, and Tudor Place Historic House and Garden. The series is funded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Today, we are focusing on family heirlooms and material culture. Our three panelists will give an overview of their work and their recommendations for caring for and learning about objects. Today, we have with us Jessie McLeod. She is the Associate Curator at George Washington's Mount Vernon. She was the lead curator for Lives Bound Together, a landmark exhibition on slavery at Mount Vernon. Jessie got her bachelor's degree in history from Yale and her master's degree in public history from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has previous curatorial experience with several organizations, including Historic Deerfield, James Madison's Montpelier, and the Newport Historical Society. We also have Dr. Tiffany Moman with us. She's a public historian and assistant professor at Sewanee, the University of the South, with years of experience participating in the preservation of community histories. Her work has taken her throughout the Southeast, organizing community-based historic preservation projects in locations such as Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the Alabama Black Belt, and the Kentucky segments of the Trail of Tears. Moman is the founder and co-director of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a Black digital humanities project that centers Black craftspeople, their lives, and their contributions to the making and building of America. Throughout her career, Moman has lectured on the subject of Black craftspeople at organizations such as the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, Winterthur Museum and Gardens, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and others. And last but not least, we have Kim Robinson. She's a curator with the National Park Service. She works with the George Washington Memorial Parkway and led the restoration and reinterpretation of Arlington House, the home of Robert E. Lee. Kim has a master's degree in museum studies from the George Washington University. And we're going to get started today with presentations from our three panelists. So Jessie, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with my wonderful panelists. Let me just share my screen. All right, are you all seeing that okay? Great. So I'm excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Mount Vernon to really look at our collection in a new way and to find avenues to explore Black history within a collection that historically has been primarily used to tell the stories of a very white population, specifically the Washington family. So as most of you probably know, Mount Vernon is about 15 miles south of Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River. It was the home of George Washington for 45 years. He lived there with his wife, Martha, for the 40 years of their marriage. But it was also home to more than 300 men, women, and children who lived on the plantation in bondage. So as you can see from this infographic, in the year of Washington's death, which is the year that we interpret the estate to today, there were about half a dozen Washington family members, about 20 hired white servants and their families, and 317 people who were enslaved. So the vast majority of the people living at Mount Vernon were living there through no choice of their own. And so their stories have an incredibly important part in the interpretation that we tell at the site today. And there are a few different ways that we can tell those stories, and I just want to touch on a couple before getting to the main part of my presentation. So we have incredible archaeological resources at Mount Vernon. There have been excavations at the site of the dwellings of enslaved people, as well as the cemetery that was used by the enslaved community. And those are really valuable in terms of gaining artifacts and knowledge about enslaved people's lives in a personal sense. So the objects that they used themselves, that they acquired, that they surrounded themselves with in their own private spaces. So this is incredibly useful for understanding the personal lives of enslaved people. So that's one really valuable resource. Another is oral history. And here you see an image from the exhibition that Mary referenced, Lives Bound Together, which opened in 2016. For this exhibition, we interviewed 7 descendants of enslaved people to get information about their family histories, as well as their own personal relationships with Mount Vernon and how they view the connection that they have through their ancestors. And so oral history, of course, is incredibly valuable for understanding Black history and the history of enslavement, because so many enslaved people were not able to become literate. And so information was passed down through oral traditions. So those are 2 incredibly important resources. But there's a third resource that I think is often not used to understand the experience of enslaved people that I really want to highlight today, and that's using the decorative arts collection. So using the fine furnishings that are throughout the house, that are often used to talk about the Washington's wealth and their impressive interiors, but less often used to interpret Black history, which in this case is the history of enslavement for the most part. So there are a few different strategies that we've used, especially in the Lives Bound Together exhibition, to really bring out some of these more unexpected stories as we look at these objects. So I want to talk about 3 of those strategies today. The first is really looking at the economic context of these objects and the products that they held. So here you see a variety of objects that are associated with sugar and sweetened beverages and rum. And those products were the result of enslaved labor. Sugar was largely harvested on Caribbean plantations by captive Africans, and demand for sugar in the 18th century really fueled the slave trade. As Europeans and colonial Americans were really wanting sugar to sweeten things like tea and coffee and chocolate, that created a huge demand, which then led to a demand for the labor to grow that crop. And so when we look at these objects, they're deeply connected to that larger context, to that larger story of slavery. And it's impossible to really understand the role that they had without looking at that violent history. And so when we look at something like this punch bowl, which is really beautiful, it has this elaborate pattern. It was made in China. It was kind of one of the finest examples of Chinese export porcelain from the mid 18th century. And that's the story that's often been told about this object when we've displayed it in the past. But when we look at this punch bowl now, we can think about it in the context of this quote from a visitor to a sugar plantation in Barbados, who described what might happen to people who were working there. So he wrote, "If a mill feeder be catched by the finger, his whole body is drawn in and is squeezed to pieces. If a boiler gets any part into the scalding sugar, it sticks like glue or birdlime, and 'tis hard to save either limb or life." So you can get a sense from that description how dangerous the conditions were on sugar plantations, how high the mortality rate was, how likely the people who were forced to work there would have gotten injured and potentially even died. And so that history is embedded in this beautiful object. And so we really have to tell both of those stories and include that difficult history alongside the more traditional history. So that's one way that we can really incorporate this other story into the interpretation of these objects. Another way that we can tell more unexpected stories is by thinking about the everyday use of these objects. So here you can see kind of glimpses into some of Mount Vernon's finely furnished interiors from the doorways. And this is the way that a lot of the enslaved people working in the household would have viewed these rooms when the Washingtons were occupying them, you know, from behind doors, from the outskirts. But the people who were working in the house were intimately familiar with the objects within it. And they were intimately involved in the Washingtons' daily lives within their home. And you can get a sense of that from this image of the Washington family, which is, of course, very famous. This is a print based on an original painting by Edward Savage, which is at the National Gallery of Art. And you can see in the background, there's this enslaved man wearing a livery suit. And that livery suit was in the colors of the Washington coat of arms, right? White and red, can't speak. And that really marked him as Washington's property. Very literally, his body was considered Washington's property. And so people like this were constantly in the background of the Washingtons' lives. And you can get another sense of that with this sketch from English architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He visited Mount Vernon in the summer of 1796. And he made this sketch, which shows Martha Washington and her granddaughter Nellie Custis on the piazza at Mount Vernon, which overlooks the Potomac River. It's a space that the Washingtons used as an outdoor parlor during the summer months. And you can see in the background, there's a Black man standing there, most likely enslaved butler Frank Lee. And he probably has just brought out the tall hot water urn that you can see has steam coming out of it, as well as a tray with a coffee pitcher and cups on the table for the Washingtons to enjoy. And so, you know, you see his presence in this image, but in the final watercolor that Latrobe made of the scene, which you can see here, that figure is missing. And so often the labor of enslaved people within the house has been erased when these spaces are interpreted. And for many years at Mount Vernon, that was the case. We weren't talking about the fact that enslaved people were constantly there doing all of this work. And so one goal that we have is to bring their stories back into the objects that furnish these spaces. So we can think about who is actually cooking the food that was served on the Washington's fine porcelain, who was cleaning those dishes when the meal was over, who was polishing the silver, who was lighting the candles in the oil lamps when it began to get dark, who was helping Washington shave, laying out his clothing, cleaning that clothing, who was caring for the children who lived at Mount Vernon. All of these objects that you see and basically everything else in our collection is connected to the labor of the people who were working in the house. And so, you know, when you really think about the daily use, the daily life of these objects, it's pretty likely that Black hands were touching them more often than white hands, that the people who were interacting with them were more often enslaved people than even the Washington family. And so their stories, the stories of people like Caroline Branham, Christopher Shields, Ona Judge, Giles Kate, many, many others, their stories are embedded in these objects too. And so one thing that we're striving to do is to tell their stories as we present these objects to visitors. And then finally, the last strategy or an additional strategy that we've used is to really look at the provenance of these objects. So provenance is just a fancy word for the history of ownership of an object. So tracking kind of who has owned an object through time. And in the case of this Windsor side chair, which has a history of belonging to the Washingtons in the 18th century, sorry, my dog is knocking my arm, eager for some attention. In the case of this Windsor side chair, the donor was Mary Gibson Hunley, who you can see here, who was a descendant of the Syphax family. And she was actually a very prominent teacher and civil rights activist. She attended Radcliffe College in the early 20th century. And she can trace her ancestry back to her grandfather, William Syphax, who was an employee of the Department of the Interior and worked very hard to improve educational opportunities for African Americans in Washington, D.C. His mother, Mariah Syphax, had been enslaved at Arlington House, the home of George Washington Parke Custis. And Mariah Syphax is generally believed to be the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis with an enslaved woman named Ariana Carter. And so Mary Gibson Hunley is actually a direct descendant of George Washington Parke Custis and by extension of Martha Washington. And she, in the information that came in with this chair, recorded that her grandfather, William Syphax, had actually saved the chair from Arlington House during the Civil War when the Union Army was occupying the area. And you'll, I imagine, hear more about this story from Kim later on. But it's a really fascinating story that really gets at kind of the complexities of family in the 19th century and the complicated web of relationships among the Washington and Custis families, and how a lot of these objects are really caught up in that complicated web. And this was a history with this object that hadn't really been explored before. You know, Mary Gibson Hunley's name is on the credit line, but nobody had really investigated who she was or used this story as a prominent interpretive point. So this is something that we really wanted to highlight. And there are actually a couple other objects in the collection as well that have a similar history, having descended through the families of formerly enslaved people. And I'll also mention there are descendants of the Syphax family who we're in touch with, and they actually didn't know about this chair. So it was incredibly powerful to be able to share that information with them and for them to see, you know, how their ancestors had preserved this object and how it ended up back at Mount Vernon. So with that, I will conclude. I'll just mention the Lives Bound Together exhibit is open through July. So if any of you are able or would like to go down to Mount Vernon, we are open. So you have a few more months to be able to see it. So with that, I will hand things over to Tiffany.
Thank you, Jessie, and I'm going to share my screen. And can everyone see the presentation here? Okay, so Mary, thank you for your earlier introduction, and thank you for inviting me today. And a big thank you to everyone behind the scenes who's making this presentation happen. Today, I'm going to give you a brief history of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, and then I'll move forward into why we do the work that we do. And so the BCDA began with a project that I started in the summer of 2018 as a graduate student. And that project centered on the life of a man named John Quash Williams and his involvement in the construction of the Pinckney Mansion pictured here on screen. Williams was an enslaved and later freed master carpenter responsible for the carpentry and joinery work on the circa 1750 Pinckney Mansion. But what emerged from detailed research into the records was Williams's story, along with the stories of several other enslaved craftspeople who were involved in the mansion's construction. And not only did these men perform work on the Pinckney Mansion, but records reveal that they also performed work around the city of Charleston and the South Carolina Lowcountry. For example, Charles, a carpenter enslaved by Charles Pinckney and one of the men that John Williams supervised on the Pinckney Mansion project, left the site of the Pinckney Mansion on August 5th, 1751, and went to work at Pinckney's store on the south end of East Bay Street. And you can see the path that Charles might have taken on the map by following the red arrow. Like Charles, Pompey also left the Pinckney Mansion in August of 1751 and headed to the harbor and boarded a boat where he would work for the next 3 days. And Pompey's possible route is highlighted on the map in blue. And while those men were enslaved by the Pinckneys and moving throughout the city to various jobs, other enslaved craftspeople were as well. For example, in August of 1771, Joe, an enslaved jeweler, self-emancipated from Charleston jeweler and enslaver John Paul Grimke. And you can see Joe's possible route on the map there in yellow. In July of 1777, Joe, a sailmaker, self-emancipated from the ship General Moultrie at Rose's Wharf, and Joe's possible route is highlighted on the map in turquoise. And in July of 1780, an enslaved caulker named Jack self-emancipated from John Russell's home on Beaton's Alley in Charleston, and his route is highlighted in orange. And so this is an example of where the project first began. We started by putting craftspeople on a map out of curiosity. We wanted to connect these Black craftspeople to place, because besides place and besides primary sources, place was the only tangible thing left to document their stories. And what quickly emerged were the spatial geographies of Black craftspeople in Charleston and across the landscape of the South Carolina Lowcountry. And then we asked ourselves, what's next? If we could map just a few people and document just a few people, what would this look like on a larger scale? Could we then use these advertisements seeking the return of self-emancipated craftspeople to tell us more about the connections between craftspeople and place? And so the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive was born, and the stories that I just mentioned and others form the foundation of the project. It is a digital humanities site dedicated to documenting the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople from about 1619 through 1900. And the website is currently home to records connected to the lives of 960 Black craftspeople, both men and women, both free and enslaved, involved in 46 total trades, from wheelwrights and tanners to cabinet makers and goldsmiths, who lived and labored in the 18th century South Carolina Lowcountry, as well as 19th century Tennessee. And we launched the beta or testing version of this site on August 31st, 2020. And we launched phase 2 of this website just this past Wednesday, which brought Tennessee into the fold. And working together as a team, we consulted with digital humanists, GIS developers, archivists, and website designers to complete what you see here. And so the project has two main components that are live right now. And the first component is the archive. The archives page will bring you here, where you have the option to browse by collection organized by trade, or use the search engine to find Black craftspeople by keyword, or even to contribute your own research or knowledge on Black craftspeople fully attributed to you. And browsing the collections will bring you to a page where you can explore all of the collections that we currently have. And the selection of a trade and a craftsperson will bring you to that person's profile. The profiles are organized using Dublin Core standards, and they include facts about the craftsperson's life, primary source documentation, in this instance, a runaway slave advertisement, and a transcription of that advertisement. And so in this example, we can see the profile of an enslaved spinner named Judy. George Muckenfoos held Judy in bondage, and on August 25th, 1779, he placed a notice in the South Carolina Gazette that Judy had self-emancipated and left his bondage with a free man of color named Andrew. And the second component of the BCDA is a digital map placing Black craftspeople on the landscape of South Carolina and now also Tennessee. And a click over to the maps page will bring you here, where you can search the data in a variety of ways. You can use if I can find my mouse here, there we go. You can use the trade count section by clicking on the bar graphs to select a specific trade. You can click the blue arrow to the left of the screen and search through a set of drop-down menus. And you can skip both of those options and search by pie chart. Clicking a specific trade on the pie chart allows you to see individuals involved in that trade only. And here I've selected shoemaker. And so if we switch back to the map view, you can see that each of the light gray dots on the map represent bricklayers. And if you were to click one of the dots, you would then get this information box on London, an enslaved bricklayer who self-emancipated from Thomas Farr's plantation in St. Mark's Parish, Sumter County, South Carolina. Included in this box, if you scroll down, is a link that will connect this dot on the map to the primary source information in the archive. And so that was a very, very brief overview of the archive and the map. And now I'd like to spend just a minute and talk about the why. Why would we begin a project such as this one? And the reason is that I wanted a resource to use that moved beyond the traditional archival collections of craftspeople and just the endless collection and cataloging of names. I wanted to better visualize the data. I wanted to ask more questions, interpret the data. I wanted to see these Black craftspeople. And I found that the best way for me to see them was through place. I wanted to facilitate discussions on movement, hence the creation of the map. And I found that there was so much more to the story that the public was not getting for a variety of reasons. And one question that I am often asked is how we at the BCDA go about doing this work. And on screen, I'm sharing our 3-point methodology, and I'm also going to show you how we put this to work. I want to stress that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to this type of work, and that this work is also important and timely. And so our methodology first takes these 3 avenues. And we begin by examining primary and secondary sources. And these can be anything from newspaper articles to census records to wills and estate records. And we comb through them looking for names and details, and we record all of that info. For example, our latest research into Tennessee literally involved us reading the census line by line, paying attention to race and occupation, looking for Black craftspeople. And then next we look at objects. And the purpose here is to take existing objects and look at them in new ways. Research them to find out more about their creation. For example, if we are taking the antebellum home of an enslaver as an object, we would then begin researching to find out who was enslaved there. What was the primary output or export of that plantation? What skills might people enslaved there have had? And all of those, we sort of layer those with the primary sources to begin to flesh out a much larger story. And something I should point out about objects here is that when we examine the object, we step away from that traditional art history approach of connoisseurship, and we center the craftsperson in our explorations of those objects and our examinations there. And our third avenue, of course, is place. And when I say place, I'm thinking, beyond just latitude and longitude points. I'm also thinking about the presence of people on place, the effects that craftspeople had on place, and the effects that place had on craftspeople. And now pre-COVID, I would go to some of these sites that I was interested in exploring. I can't wait to be able to do that again. But again, that's all in an effort to be able to tell more about these stories of Black craftspeople. And I also have to mention that all of this put together rests on the context of Black life. We cannot understand Black craftspeople without understanding the tribulations that they faced being Black in this country. So that's everything there rests on that context. And so I want to discuss just 1 minute how we think about objects and material culture. And so when we're presented with objects that we can attribute to Black craftspeople, these are the sorts of questions that we begin to ask ourselves. And as I've mentioned, this project is all about centering Black craftspeople. So when we definitely begin with the question, who made the object, of course, but then we continue with a series of questions to flesh out the craftsperson's life. One of my favorite questions here on screen is, how is craft knowledge produced by Black life? And when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about how creators find new ways of doing things, and then they spread that knowledge on to people that they are also training in the trades that they are involved in. And so all of this work aids us in telling stories, such as the story of the Pointer family of Williamson County, Tennessee. And Richard Dick Pointer was an enslaved and later free craftsman who was a chair maker. He was born enslaved in Virginia and held in bondage by Robert Poynter of Halifax County, Virginia. And when Robert Poynter and his family relocated to Williamson County, Tennessee in 1816, of course, they took Richard Dick Poynter along with them. And so by 1850, Richard Poynter was placing advertisements in Tennessee declaring that he was a free man and that he was available to make chairs. And so Richard Poynter would go on to create a horse-powered chair factory and teach the art of chair making to his family members. And some of the chairs crafted by Poynter and his family members are pictured here on screen. And ever so often, my friends in the museum field will reach out to me about objects that they find connected to Black craftspeople. And so here, Annabeth Hayes, decorative arts curator at the Tennessee State Museum, reached out to me about a wheel lathe belonging to a Black wheelwright named William Parkey. Now, Parkey lived in the Rebel Hollow community of Hancock, Tennessee, and he was both a blacksmith and a wheelwright. And so during our conversation, Annabeth mentioned that the Museum of Appalachia in Clinton, Tennessee, had several objects involving the family, including their blacksmith shop. And so I quickly asked her to give me just a moment to hold on because I'd visited the Museum of Appalachia as a student years earlier. And as I was going through my photographs, I actually found out that I had an image of that blacksmith shop that you see pictured here on screen. And so this story begins with patriarch Newton Parkey, born in 1847, died in 1915, who was enslaved by a white man named Joseph Parkey. And Newton's son, William, born in 1865 and died in 1932, followed in his father's footsteps and became a woodworker and a blacksmith. And then William's son, Steve Parkey, born in 1909, died in 1978, continued in that family business. And today, artifacts from that family, including their entire blacksmith shop, are being preserved by the Museum of Appalachia. And so to me, that's a great Tennessee story, but it also speaks to the work that we do here at the BCDA by collaborating with museums, museum curators, as well as genealogists and family members to flesh out a much larger story of Black craftspeople on the Southern landscape. And so now I am going to turn the presentation over to Kim.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Tiffany and to Jesse for such great presentations. As you guys were going through your topics, you inspired all kinds of ideas in my head, but I'm gonna try to keep it to 10. I'm trying to keep it to 10 minutes. But let me share my screen here. I have been having some internet issues, so if for some reason I drop off, I will just jump right back on, just as a warning. I'm located within Arlington National Cemetery and right next to the Pentagon, and sometimes there's just a little bit of interference. Not that we get paranoid about that or anything. Good afternoon. My name is Kim Robinson, as Mary so graciously introduced us, and I am the museum curator for the George Washington Memorial Parkway, an MPS unit here in the DC metro area. I am duty stationed, as we like to say, in the Park Service at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, and work at Arlington House, which is located within that site. Today, what I thought I would do was look at material culture as it is applied in certain cases within the national park system, specifically in regards to how we went about updating our exhibits focused on African American history here at the 19th century plantation estate, as well as how we updated our historically furnished period rooms and our dependencies, the North and South slave quarters. Before I dive into the bulk of the presentation, when I begin any talk, I always highlight that anything we do here at the park is tied to the National Park Service missions to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources of the park system, and to do it for the benefit of for natural and cultural resource preservation. As one of the 423 now NPS units across the country and in our territories, we're very proud to tell the stories of all Americans at the GWNP. So what really started us on this journey was a need for updates and to preservation of the historic structure, as well as how we told the stories at the site. Today, following an extensive rehab, which you can see in these pictures, we are prepared to share the results of our hard work, which we're going to get into in a second. That includes the rehab of the historic mansion or manor or our main house, and of course, our historic dependencies, the North and South slave quarters. And here they are today. For those who aren't familiar with Arlington House, it was owned, the original 1,100 acre plantation estate was owned by a gentleman named George Washington Parke Custis. And it was constructed in 3 stages between 1802 and 1818. The historic dependencies that we're going to focus on today were constructed following the building of the main house between 1818 and 1824. The collections that we're going to share a few highlights from today include about 40,000 objects. The historic main house itself and its dependencies were constructed in what's called the Greek Revival style, and the elements and features of all the buildings that we're going to highlight today echo that style. While the house was owned by Custis, it was actually built by a combination of the labor of indentured, enslaved, and free workers. It is actually, all the structures that you're going to see today were actually brick buildings, and they were covered in stucco and decorated with various faux finishes. Arlington House has an interesting legislative history, which we don't have time to get into today, but it was established as a historic site, originally the Custis Mansion, then the Custis Lee Mansion, and later Arlington House, the Robert Lee Memorial in 1925, and became a part of the park system in 1933, along with a host of other sites. Some of the key figures that are part of our story include those associated with the Washington, Custis, and Lee families. That includes George Washington Parke Custis, who was the grandson of Martha, First Lady Martha Washington. And he actually grew up in Mount Vernon along with his sister, Eleanor Parke Custis. And he considered, George Washington was treated as his adopted step granddad, and they had a very close relationship, and he idolized Washington. And that's actually why Arlington House was first built as an early memorial to President Washington, where he would showcase his Washington treasury and things highlighting Washington. Of course, we also have Robert E. Lee and his wife, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee. Lee marries into the family. He marries Mrs. Lee in 1831, and he becomes a part of the story after that. He spent the 30 years living up to the American Civil War, in part when he wasn't out on various campaigns at Arlington. Of course, the stories, those aren't the only stories and key figures that we highlight at Arlington House. We also honor the legacies of those who lived, worked, and died at the plantation. That includes, of course, as Jesse alluded to, Marie Syphax, her husband Charles, and their many children. Marie Syphax was enslaved at the plantation and was the daughter of Mr. Custis, as Jesse already highlighted. She was eventually freed and was given property on a plantation estate close to where Henderson Hall and the Pentagon are today. And the family would continue to prosper even to this day. And as Jesse mentioned, they are great partners to numerous institutions, the White House, the Park Service, as well as Mount Vernon, and exploring their family's history and helping us to better honor their legacy. We also tell the story of wonderful figures such as Selena Gray, who, while she was Mrs. Lee's personal maid, her story is so much more than that. And that is something we dive into in our exhibits. And of course, we also tell the story of James Parks and his family and their legacy. James Parks was 18 when the war broke out, and he would go on to work for what was the early Arlington National Cemetery. I highlight those stories because we were able to really dive into the legacies and that history, thanks to a generous, and what brought us to where we are today with the newly renovated site is thanks to a generous donation from David Rubenstein. Not only did it focus on key physical aspects of the site, including a rehab of the mansion, as well as the outbuildings in our grounds to make them more accessible. And as any curator would appreciate, improvements to our HVAC system and our fire suppression, miracles. But it also involved major updates to our interpretive exhibits and the stories that we tell, as well as updates to museum collection and conservation of museum collection, which gave us a unique opportunity to really reimagine how we tell the many stories of Arlington. For the purposes of this exercise, we're really going to drill down into the updated interpretive exhibits, as well as the museum artifacts featured in our historic dependencies. Things to think about as we talk about material culture, and this is a part of this process, are the reimagined interpretive themes that came out of this process. The thing that we are hoping that visitors walk away with now when they visit the estate is that this place was a place of division and reunification. It was a working plantation where many people lived and died. These are also a subset of some of the deeper themes that we are exploring in our new exhibits. Again, highlighting that while Lee is a part of the story, he is actually, I would argue, the smallest part, as cumulatively, I like to point out that he was only here for 7 years, cumulatively leading up to the war. So but we won't get into those matters right now. But the key themes of Arlington that we have recreated are that it's a memorial to George Washington, that it was a family home to the Custis and Lee family, but that was also, most critically, a place where an oppressed community struggled for freedom, that it was a trophy of war. It went from a trophy of war to hallowed ground, and that, again, that it was a place of division and unification. All of these themes and ideas fed into how we developed the exhibits and focused on material culture as we were developing our period rooms and our new exhibits. The exhibits are spread across what we called 5 scenes, AKA 5 buildings and locations. We today are going to be focusing on scene number 2, which is in the South Slave Quarters, and we're going to be looking at objects associated with our exhibits in the slave quarters, along with how we reimagined our period rooms through a material culture lens. So for the Park Service, we look at material culture in a slightly different way, but of course we still, keep in mind that material culture does encompass tools, weapons, and all these other materials that are produced and used by humans, and that of course is the base when we're talking about material culture. I really liked the statement that I found that just kind of sums up what material culture can mean, is that we understand that material culture, move this real quick, it helps us understand societies of both the past and present, and through the careful study and observation of the physical material objects generated from these societies, we can have so that's why it's so important that we look at objects as a part of understanding our history and our stories that we tell and how they can tie into that. So for the Park Service, that means when we're trying to understand stories and cultures that we preserve at our sites, we translate that through looking at how objects tie to key interpretive themes. When we're selecting objects to put in our period rooms or put in an exhibit, we carefully examine primary sources and object ID. Those kind of traditional things are a part of what informs our understanding of our collections. For us, resources, in addition to traditional primary sources like archives and key documents, we also look at oral histories. That's a huge part of what we do when we're telling the different stories of the Park Service, because of course some communities do not have as much written record, so we heavily rely on oral history when we are interpreting and telling stories at our sites. In a more traditional sense, when we're looking at objects and trying to tie them into key themes, we're making sure we look heavily at provenance. And we also tie that in when we have an object, we also look at the knowledge of common practices. So how were these objects used at other similar estates and properties? And when we're developing our period rooms especially, that helps us frame how we should be furnishing them and showcasing them. We also look at when we're trying to develop how to use an object for various uses. We look at our park records as well as internal and external archives. And most importantly, we're looking at historical significance of said object. So to frame that into a practical context, so how does that translate? So for example, for the purposes of Arlington House, one of the themes that we were looking at for furnishing the scene 2, the South Slave Quarters, was where an oppressed community struggle for freedom. And we tried to find objects that tied to that theme. When we were looking at objects and trying to confirm if they were a fit for that theme, we looked at personal correspondence that provided background on them. We looked at inventories associated with the people who owned those objects to confirm if they were at Arlington. We looked to the manufacturer information to confirm if the objects were in fact authentic. We were very fortunate when we were developing our exhibits that we have oral histories associated with the descendants of the enslaved here, including the daughters of Selena Gray. And we also, when we're looking at records, we're looking at if they were donated or purchased and going through accession files and other critical records to confirm the origins of those objects. And when we're doing research into our key documents, which we're going to touch on in a second, we're looking at conventional and non-conventional sources. I found that when we were researching collections, that looking at local historical societies as well as local government records was key for us, as well as our databases, as well as larger well-known archives like the National Archives and Library of Congress. And again, for us, it's all about how these objects tie to key figures and stories. So when we're talking about applying a material culture for the Park Service, there's kind of 2 main things that I'm gonna talk about how we applied it for this project. We were very lucky as a part of the donation to be able to update what's called the Historic Furnishings Report. And these reports document furnishings that were exhibited in associated historic structures. They document the history of a structure's use and its interior appearance, and if appropriate, provide a plan for recreating or maintaining the historic interior. So for us, that is kind of provides a framework and a foundation for how we go about exhibiting collections in these spaces. So as we're developing these reports, we rely heavily on primary sources. For example, as they were crafting the report for the dependencies, they were able to look to documents such as this inventory of those who were once enslaved at Arlington House. This was taken from the Will of Custis, which we actually found not at an archive like the Virginia Historical Society or at National Archives. This was actually tucked away in the courthouse in Old Town Alexandria in a file cabinet. So not the best storage conditions, but that's sometimes how you find these things. So that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to dig into your own personal collections and resources, that you have to think about taking an uneven route to get to where you need to go. But what these documents do is they provide a list of recommended furnishings based on this careful research that I mentioned. And then we apply all of that information gathered to the period rooms that you see, and they include a combination of reproductions, antiques, and associated objects, all combined to create immersive spaces that help us to tell these stories and really create a real sense of the space. So that's a very brief and quick overview of how a historic furnishings report can really help, and through a material cultural lens, in developing these spaces. And then really quickly, another aspect of how we applied material culture when developing the exhibits was exhibit curation and selecting artifacts for exhibit. The object we're going to touch on really quickly is this cream picture that is featured in our South Slave Quarters exhibit. So you would think, so this picture is Arho 216, I have to throw in a catalog number, and it was produced circa 1850. If you're familiar with the manufacturer Wedgwood, you know that they were famous for their jasperware china. And this particular piece is a cobalt blue made in the neoclassical style, features traditional Greek and Roman figures. And it has a raised relief. And of course, Wedgwood, like all Wedgwood pieces, was manufactured in China. So why would we feature something like this in the South Slave Quarters? Well, that is because it ties to Selena Gray, one of the folks that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So as I said earlier, when we're talking about material culture, we're looking at not only how an object fits interpretive themes, we're looking at who is associated with. And this object in particular was a gift to the was acquired by the National Park Service from one of her daughters, pictured here in the center, Annie Gray Baker. So we know, thanks to our collections records and thanks to the oral histories that we have, again, that primary source research, that before the war broke out, Mrs. Lee gave that picture to Selena Gray. And that during the interviews that took place for the restoration of Arlington House in the 1920s and 30s, Annie Baker returned that picture to Arlington House for use for exhibit and to better honor and highlight the legacy of her family. So thanks to, so when we're looking at it through material culture, we're looking at and why we decided to feature that object on our exhibits is that obviously the historical significance and association with Selena Gray made it something that we wanted to highlight in that space. And I should mention that the theme of that space was, what was life like for those who were once enslaved at that plantation after 1865? What happened to their descendants? So this object tied in perfectly with that theme. So again, historical significance is a huge part of what we're talking about when we're talking about material culture. We also looked at more traditional things where we're talking about material culture, confirming the origins of the object, confirming that it was a Wedgwood piece, thanks to looking at things like its maker's mark, looking at similar items on the fair market to confirm its status, and resources like that helped us to confirm the objects, not only that it was authentic, but also that it was suitable to be included in that scene. And here it is in the planning stages, and then now on our exhibits that we hope to open soon. And we're very excited to hopefully share that with the public soon. Just really quickly before I wrap up, when we're doing research and we're not only selecting objects to put on an exhibit, but also thinking about acquiring artifacts, these are just some of the things we think about in the Park Service and sources that we use to do that basic ID of objects, to confirm that it's authentic and to confirm that it fits into those interpretive themes and stories that we tell. And that's just an example from ICOM of questions that you should ask when you are thinking about acquiring, looking for more information of things in your possession. And then these are just some of the sources that we have used in the past that help us with research into collections and confirming their suitability for exhibit. And with that, thank you all for having me today. I was excited to share a bit about our project, and I'm eager to take your questions when we get to that point in the discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all three of you for that wonderful discussion. It was so great to hear about your work and how you're using material culture. And now we are going to ask these folks to apply these skills and perspectives that they've shared with us in real time. So I'm going to share with you. Everybody can see my screen. This is a headscarf and certificate of freedom that belonged to a woman named Catherine Taylor. This is in the collection of Dumbarton House and the NSCDA. And Catherine Taylor was born around 1820 and died in or around 1892. She was enslaved by the Madison family at Montpelier and was freed in 1852. This headscarf belonged to her, and this is a certificate of freedom from the Circuit Court of DC, stating that she and her children are free. So Jesse, Kim, and Tiffany, if you came across this object, what would you do to keep it safe while you researched it? And then what would you do to learn more about it? So take all these skills that you've just told us about and tell us how you would approach this particular object.
Sure, I don't know who wants to dive in first, but in terms of keeping it safe, from a collections management standpoint, you would first, if it's, well, a lot of times when we receive gifts or acquire things from a private lender, private donor, or private company, they are not necessarily packed according to what we call archival or preservation standards. So the first thing we would do is make sure the object, both the letter and the textile, were housed in proper archival materials that are pH neutral, not non-acidic, forgive me. So we would probably make sure to repack the headscarf in particular in unbuffered acid-free tissue. And then we would probably house it in a properly sized textile box. And then for the archival document, I would say we would probably, first of all, before doing any of this, I want to consult with the conservator to confirm the condition of the artifact and to, if we don't have the money right away, to come up with a plan for treatment in the future. Before repacking it, I should have said that at the beginning. You should always consult with the conservator in regards to your artifacts. But for the paper document, I would rehouse that as well, probably house it in a Mylar sleeve or Mylar along with an archival folder, and then store it in an appropriate way and as a first part of receiving the artifact before we get into the ID side of it. Sorry, I kind of jumped in, ladies. I don't know if you have anything, Tiffany or Jesse.
Sure. No problem, Kim. What I wanted to say is for the work that I do, I would definitely begin by first dissecting that letter. I would make a list of every name, jot down the relationships between the names. Does the letter mention that this woman has children? If so, I want to jot that down and write down their relationship to the owner of the object. And then in thinking about centering them, I, of course, would want to do more background research on that family. Can I pick them up on later census records? Can I pick them up on city directories? If I can pick them up on a city directory, can I, and one of the things I'm aware of is that street names often change over time. But one of the things that I'd be attempting to do is, of course, pulling up earlier maps of the city, trying to see if I can pinpoint a location for them within the city to give me an idea of what their everyday might have been like. What, when they open the window, what would they have seen outside? Type of an approach. And then I would probably try to trace them throughout history. So pulling on a little bit of that genealogy, again, seeing how far I could take them in order to learn more about their family, their dynamic, and of course, the owner of the object. And then I would also, of course, think about additional questions about the object itself. What is it made of? What's a good description for it? Is this something that the owner might have, that someone might have purchased for her from a store, or different things like that? How did she come into possession of the object? How might she have worn or used the object? And then I would also think about things of identity, because when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about that bright red, vibrant color, right? And so thinking about this object in terms of its adornment, as an object of adornment for the owner here. And then I would just sort of continue in that line again, fleshing out their life, thinking about where she might have worn this, what else she might have paired with this particular scarf as well. And Jesse, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so you all have covered a lot and made some really great points. I'll echo some of what Kim was saying in terms of the conservation, especially of the headscarf. Textiles are really, really rare survivals from the 19th century and earlier because they're so sensitive to things like light and moisture and pests. So this is an incredibly unusual survival. So it's something that you'd want to be really careful with in terms of how you preserved it. And you'd want to make sure that you were taking as many steps as possible to prevent all of those dangers from worsening its condition. I'll also add on to what Tiffany was saying in terms of analyzing the object itself. You know, with something like a textile, especially one with a really elaborate pattern like this, you can look at the technique that was used to decorate it, as well as the details in the decorative motif itself, as a way to potentially identify the origin of the textile, identify perhaps the maker, the manufacturer. You can also potentially date it based on the pattern. So if you're able to find a similar pattern in a museum's collection or elsewhere, that could potentially help you narrow down when it was made. And that might help tell you when the owner acquired it, which is useful information. And then just again, what Tiffany was saying about fashioning identity, I think something like this is a really valuable tool for understanding the owner's sense of themselves, especially if she acquired it when she was still enslaved. You know, what might that have meant to her to have this item that provided some measure of individuality and might have provided some measure of choice in her appearance when otherwise she likely did not have many choices in her own life. So questions like that can really help flesh out, you know, how this object came to be, where it came from, and what it might have meant to the person who owned it.
No, that's a great point, Jesse. And I actually had to turn off my video due to my ongoing internet problems. Especially, I did want to also highlight, just to echo Jesse's point, the fact that this piece has been preserved from the 19th century. It really is rare. And that vibrant nature of the color, the red in particular, is also very rare and very incredible. Also, I was just wanted to add in terms of like object ID and targeting, things like that. I would also maybe check various repositories that may have a record of catalog or database of prints or patterns from the 19th century. You know, I can think off the top of my head of resources like the Victoria and Albert Museum, which actually surprisingly has a lot of resources associated with US sites, or the Met might have some records on textiles made in a similar style or vein. That is also a resource that you could tap. And in terms of doing more information on the associated document, the letter, I would maybe also want to check maybe DC government records and archives to see if they have any other materials associated with Mrs. Tate, to see if there's any other information that you can garner about her and her family and their legacy there. Because I think combined, these two objects tell a really powerful story. And if there may be an opportunity to even find more documents and materials to provide more deep insight into their background.
Yeah, I'll just add too, if you're seeking information, especially about dating an object or just wanting to get an idea of where it might have been made, or you know, or just suggestions on where to learn more, your friendly local museum curator is often a good resource. And a lot of museums have a kind of collections inquiry general email where you can submit a question. For example, at Mount Vernon, we have a collections inquiry email where questions come into curators and we respond to them. So you know, you can ask for help from people who have experience working with these types of collections, and usually we have some type of suggestion. Even if we can't answer all of your questions, we can point you in the right direction.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I would also say please call, because I'd rather much so talk about beautiful headscarves and historic documents like this than to do what I do yesterday, which is fix our security alarm system. So you're always here as a resource.
Wonderful. That was amazing. Thank you all for sharing your skill in so quickly. That was maybe 10 minutes, and to just dissect this object and figure out the best method for finding its history. I think that was really wonderful. So for those of you in the audience, you are welcome to submit your questions. If you have any you want to know about or anything you were curious about in the presentation, if you have something in your family that you want to know how to get the ball rolling on your research and preservation of that object, please feel free to submit those questions in the Q&A box or through the chat function. And one thing that we were interested in, oh, you guys already answered all those questions.
Yeah, a lot of the questions Mary and I hadn't got answered, but I will start with one, and this is specifically for you, Tiffany. Do you, how can people get involved if they think they have resources or can learn more about the Black Craftspeople Archive?
Sure. So you can email me directly, and I'll put my email in the chat box. But there's also a part on the website in the archive that there's a link there that says contribute. And so it takes you to a form where you can contribute any info that you have. And then all of that shoots directly over to us. And then we can reach out to you. We can reach out to you that way as well.
Great. And I did have another one. I'm going to sneak it in here. This probably applies to both Jesse and Kim, so you can feel free to answer this. But are there any objects at either of your institutions that you specifically don't display or are sensitive about displaying or won't display, whether it's for fragility or for a sensitive topic, or have to think really deeply about before you interpret them for view?
Yeah, we definitely have some more, the ones that spring to mind immediately, it's for conservation reasons, for fragility. So we have George Washington's Q bag or hair bag, which if you've seen the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington, if you look carefully in the back, you can see there's kind of a black bag with a bit of a kind of scalloped edge that held his ponytail or Q, and that was kind of a style in the 1790s. So we have his Q bag. It's made of silk, but it's incredibly, incredibly fragile. Basically, if you breathe on it the wrong way, it will start to disintegrate. So we have it carefully packed away in our storage facility. And, you know, it's really only available for research. And even then, we're pretty strict about who we let access it. So that's one where, you know, we have it documented, we have it photographed, and so people can learn about it that way. But the object itself is so fragile that we're hesitant to put it out.
No, absolutely. And for us in particular at Arlington, but across the Parkway, really, one of the collection types that we're challenged to showcase are our archaeological artifacts. We do a lot of archaeology associated with Section 106, and it's tied to compliance to make sure that we're not damaging historic resources, both above and in the ground. So in particular for the Arlington project, you know, as they were doing utilities work as a part of the rehab side of things, they came across a lot of artifacts associated with the early history of the site, not only tied to the Washington, but also Washingtons and the Custis's and the Lees, but also those things that were tied to the history and legacy of the enslaved. And some of those artifacts were sensitive in nature, associated with, for example, spiritual or religious practices that we have to be careful about how we highlight and display those, being mindful about how we treat those artifacts. While not at our park, while we don't particularly have any human remains or materials like that associated in our archaeological collections, for other parks, they do hold back on displaying things like that due to the sensitivity issues.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be definitely hard to interpret as well. Mm-hmm. So we did get one question in the chat about the letters and how to best preserve some things like letters and paper items. If you can speak to that.
Yes, well, absolutely. So I know one thing, for example, what we did is for any paper, with the exception of a few, we first of all made a high resolution, high quality reproduction of it, so that when we did want to share it with the public, we were keeping the original, protected it intact, but we still were able to share it with our partners and with the public. In terms of specifically how to best preserve or protect paper or archival material, as I said, you want to first and foremost protect it from light damage. For us, anywhere where we have historic paper or textiles on exhibit, it's all of the windows are filtered against UV light. UV light is one of the light in general is one of the things that will damage your paper materials and textiles the most. So making sure that your paper document is protected from light damage is critical. You also want to make sure, especially for paper, that it's, if possible, resting. Well, we try to keep our paper resting flat. You want to make sure that you're not putting any pressure on the paper itself and not causing any tears or bend outside of any natural bends. So we keep that in mind as well. And in terms of materials that you want to use for housing it, again, archival material, so that means acid-free. So from vendors such as Gaylord Archival or Hollinger Metal Edge, not that I'm doing a sales pitch, but they sell archival quality museum grade materials that will, while they're not going to last forever, they are acid-free and will not leach into the actual paper or material that you're trying to protect. And what we do for a lot of our historic documents in the Park Service anyway, is that we put layers of protection when we're storing the items. So in addition to having it in our archival quality folder or other sleeve, we also do put a barrier of Mylar, which is a polyethylene film, plastic film, that helps to provide a barrier to protecting it as well. And if we're putting a archival document on exhibit, the original document, we're also going to put it in an Mylar or polyethylene sleeve as well. And that again is protected from mostly light damage and from handling as well. One of the best things you can do for paper is to not handle it too much. So
I remember Mary posted, thank you, Mary, for posting the YouTube link to our last session where we did talk a little bit about that as well. So thank you all for that.
I'll just add to what Kim said. Just one little thing. If there are paper clips on your documents, make sure you take them off because they will rust if they're metal.
Yes.
We've had a few incidents with that sort of thing in our files. And there's one other thing I was going to say, but it just escaped me. So yes, just remember to remove your paper clips.
Something I learned early on working in museums is to use pencils or when I'm near anything. So I'm just in the habit. I'm home. I'm not even at a museum, and I've got a pencil. So when Tiffany was talking about jotting down information, I was picturing a pencil, which I think most archivists and researchers use as well. We did get a question.
I did remember what I was going to say. Sorry.
Oh, great.
And when handling documents, actually best practices now is to not use gloves. You might have this image of archivists with their white gloves kind of handling historic documents, but they actually find that kind of clean, bare hands are best because you have more dexterity and you're not at risk of kind of ripping things as you're handling them. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
No, agreed. And also for paper clips, not just metal paper clips, but plastic coated paper clips as well. Don't think that just because Staples put that on there that's protecting your item. It is not.
That's great advice. So we have a question from the audience. Do you have any recommendations for language on how to describe material culture items in records, or when you're reaching out, if you have a question for someone, like, is there a specific language that would be helpful in describing their questions? Or
Yes, so there are several for cataloging or IDing artifacts. There are several sources that you can use to be in conjunction with standard language that a museum professional or appraiser might be familiar with. You can look to the Chin Hall's nomenclature that's produced by the American Association of State and Local History. They're a great resource. Also, the Getty has things that can assist with object ID in their art and architecture database. And I believe in Net Parks Canada also has a nomenclature database that can also provide standard terms and terminology for cataloging artifacts or IDing artifacts. Those are some of the things that immediately pop into my mind.
Thank you. I had not heard of the Canadian one there. I have another question here. Can you expand, and this is to all the panelists, on the relationship you maintain and develop with descendants of enslaved individuals, and how do your organizations manage object or image ownership with descendants?
So I can speak to this. Mount Vernon has had kind of ongoing relationships with many descendants over the last few decades, and particularly as we've been expanding our interpretation of slavery with the exhibit and other projects, we've been able to connect with more and more people, which is really exciting. And previously, a lot of that work was done kind of on a an informal basis. So as we were developing the exhibit, we kind of reached out and had meetings and calls and that sort of thing, but it wasn't really structured or part of our institutional mission. But we actually recently had a position created that's specifically for descendant outreach and interpretation of African American history. So we kind of have that now codified into our institutional structure, which is really exciting. And we're starting to do more outreach, like having a quarterly newsletter that goes out to descendants. And potentially in the future, we hope to have more events, reunions at Mount Vernon that will be able to bring the descendant community together. So we have a lot of really wonderful relationships already, but we're excited about expanding them. And in terms of objects and images, that hasn't come up a huge amount. There have been a few cases where we have borrowed objects from descendants, where things have descended in their family, or we have used a graphic of an image that is owned by a descendant. We haven't had any conflicts about objects having come into Mount Vernon's collection in kind of an untoward way and having to deal with ownership issues, which I know has sometimes happened at other sites. So we've been fortunate that most of those conversations have been positive and productive.
And I'll try to keep it short because my internet continues to be a plague today. But I will say that in terms of reaching out and maintaining in relationships with donors and partners, well, for the Park Service, it's been a bit of a spotty history. Originally, we would reach out for special events and special programs and invite our descendant community partners and local community groups like our surrounding churches, including churches historically associated with the property, to the site for special events tied to key moments in history like emancipation, or to highlight special events like a commemoration of the wedding of Charles and Maria Syphax. So that was what we did in the past, but thanks to this project and the ongoing efforts of our leadership team here at the park, we've been able to really, to echo what Mount Vernon has been doing, really codify that, to really not just have it be for a special program or special event, but to really build those relationships. We started by establishing a community of practice with local community groups, with local scholars, and with members of the descendant community. And we had some kickoff sessions where we discussed our goals for how we can better tell all stories in Arlington, but also how we can share resources and be partners in a real collaborative way. And since that initial kickoff of the community practice, our leadership team at that level has hired a community planner who's one of her key parts of her position is to reach out to our descendant partners, as well as community groups, including churches, to really, right now they're focused on facilitation, like facilitating the relationships between the enslaved community and descendants of the Lee family, focused on key, serious, critical issues like that. So that's how so it started as a really small effort for community outreach, and it's really built into something that we hope to continue in the long term, not just to include loans to the Park Service, and donations to the Park Service of artifacts, but to also really have an impact on relationships between the various groups and to help these families get more information and knowledge about their history of their ancestors here. So.
I like hearing about it becoming part of who you are as institutions too. I think that that's a really great way to really make sure that the history is interpreted. Jerry has a question. He asks, how do you know what family items or relics are important? Pictures and documents, that's easy. You want to save those, you want to see those people. But what about other things? The things like the scarf, how do you know that you should save that and look into that, and what's important? I know I take a lot of stuff to Goodwill that my grandmother would not like, but.
I mean, important is subjective. So, that's kind of a hard question to answer in the abstract. I think if it's important to you, it's important. So if you feel that you want to save something because of its connection to your family, then, it's worth saving. If you don't feel connected to it, but are curious if it is, valuable or kind of part of a larger historical narrative, I think that's where reaching out to a local museum and getting a curator's opinion can be helpful. We get a lot of questions like that. A lot of times people want to donate stuff, kind of offload stuff to Mount Vernon that was their grandmother's that they don't necessarily have space for, but don't want to give to Will. And, we rarely can accept stuff like that. But, I think in that case, asking somebody who is experienced in the field can give you a sense of whether it's something that is rare or unusual. And it helps in that case if you do have documentation of its maker or some kind of context of where it came from. But yeah, so that can tell you kind of whether it's part of, a larger kind of historical narrative. But again, important in what way? It's hard to answer that because it is a personal question.
And I was just thinking, I would add that Jesse mentioned objects that where you can identify a maker. So yes, I would definitely consider objects such as those as important, things that you would want to save. And then I also think objects that speak directly to your family's experience in this country, that speaks to your family's sort of cultural identity, objects that, if your grandmother had a cake plate or something that was so special that she brought it out on every holiday, like some objects such as those that sort of speak to your family, I think are also very important. But again, important, the word important can be, it just depends. So.
Yes, and just to tack on, I was going to say, one of the things you can do when you're trying to find out this information to determine, try to figure out more about your collection is really leveraging your collections records. I know one of the things we have set aside in our database is space if the object is associated with a key figure, and information and background on the donor. So, when you have time, that elusive thing, trying to do that collections-based research to really try to find more background on pieces of your collection. For example, one of the pieces that you wouldn't necessarily associate, quote unquote, a handmade 4-leg table that we have, a side table that we have, you would think a wooden side table from the 19th century is not that important. But when you find out that it was donated by a descendant of the enslaved and that it was handcrafted by an enslaved worker on one of the other plantation estates, when you dive into those things, that's when you find out the true importance of the object. So it's definitely about leveraging your records, leveraging your resources to try to take the time to do that research about things. Even the most innocuous thing can have so much importance associated with it and historical significance.
Yeah, I'll just say this conversation has been making me think. I have this little piece of leather on my desk that has this beautiful work in it. My dad made this. It has a signature on the back. He made it when he was 16 in woodworking class to prove that he could handle more complex tools, including welding tools, because his dad was a welder. And his dad wanted him to learn to weld, and he had to pass this test in order to be able to do that. So it's just a little tiny scrap of leather. It doesn't really matter, but it matters to me because it has a significance not only to my father, but to my grandfather, who I never met. And so that's a story that I should write down so that someday other people in my family can know where this came from and why it's important to us and what it means. And it's just those kind of little details that can really make something important to your story and your family's story.
Yeah, and Mary, when you write that down, you'll put that in archival sleeve.
I will. Right now, it's just sitting on my desk,
Mylar,
covered in dust. I need to really take all of your advice to heart.
We also have some advice in the chat as well. That's great. Is to tell other people about it. That's where the oral histories come from. So continue to tell those stories like you just told, Mary.
Well, wonderful. I think that's everything that we had planned for today. Thank you to Tiffany and Jesse and Kim for your wonderful insights today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work with us. It was a wonderful afternoon to spend with all of you. And as I mentioned in the chat, we will kind of gather up all those links, all the resources that Tiffany and Jesse and Kim mentioned. We'll gather those up and send those out later so that you can access those resources if you are interested. And I know that Jesse mentioned that if people have questions about objects, you can always find your local curator. So we'll be sure to include some good museums if you need to look into something, some good people that might be able to help you with identifying those objects. I hope all of you have a lovely afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for joining us. The next installation of the Black Georgetown Community History Project is on April 16th. Same time, 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We don't have everything locked down for that yet, but we're working on it. We're working really hard. So keep your eyes peeled, and we will post information for that very soon. So thank you once again for your support, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.